Really exciting, extremely pleasurable for me to present you our first speaker of autumn 2021, a speaker on the topic idtalks race, Mohamed Barrie, a social worker lecturer at Karel de Grote University College, who is very engaged in community work, very active in the community in Flanders, Belgium. He is one of the core members behind first Black Student Union in Flanders, and also a cultural coordinator in a Black youth organization, Kilalo. Today he's joining us early morning from the United States. So my pleasure and honor to welcome and pass you the floor. Mohamed, please, you can start.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon over there. So when I was asked to do this presentation, I tried to collect my thoughts because obviously the topic of race, it's a huge one, but even more so after the BLM protests last year, which were bigger than the ones that we had in 2015. The topic of race has been brought up to the agenda in many European countries, especially the countries with a lot more Black people at the forefront. So in this presentation I'm giving you, it's rather a put together solution, even though it's such a big topic. So it's not it doesn't encompass everything I would want to speak about. Please note that. Due to the time I've had to make some very hard decisions. But I'm glad with what I could put together. And also, try to be very engaging. So for me, the most important thing in this conversation is your participation next to just listening and trying to learn maybe new things. For those who are maybe well immersed in the topic, you would have to forgive me because I'm starting at a pretty basic level, because I don't know who has read what, who has seen what. So I'm starting from that level, building it up all the way. So I'm pretty much open to questions along the way. If you think, okay, I know this, but what about this? Pretty welcome to do that. I have like a button that's okay, found it. So yeah, like I call the presentation Race Ally with Material and Mental Costs. Basically, this will explain itself through what I'm about to present to you. So in short, who am I? It's already been said a bit, but yeah, I like to see myself as someone who creates spaces for Black people where their potential basically is brought up. These are two images of the 2019 edition of Black History Month Belgium, which I co-founded and co-coordinate. It was an exhibition of the opening where we had asked Black Belgians about what freedom means to them. And in doing so, a lot of youngsters who didn't even think about themselves as artists or photographers literally found their voice through the camera they were using. That's one. But also, next to being a community organizer, through the years I've worked in various spaces as a youth worker. For the past decade, I've worked in, as you can see on the photo on the right, that was me when I was 19, working at youth camps, working with children from various ages, communities, and backgrounds. And me on the left, this photo was taken last summer when we were holding a camp, even during COVID, for girls that want to play football. So this is just to give you like a little introduction to who I am and what I do. Voila. I want to start with this quote. I'm looking, is there anyone that can tell me who said these words? They might be pretty shocking, but please take a look and read through it. Are there any suggestions in the chat or someone that wants to say something through the camera? Who might have said these words?
Yeah, if you would like to, you can always raise a hand in this reaction bar or write directly in the chat. But it seems, Mohamed, we don't have an answer for now.
Okay.
Prophet Mohamed, somebody suggests in the chat.
Okay. So this is a quote from Gandhi. I think for some people it's maybe shocking due to the very clear racist tone it has in it towards Black people. But Gandhi used to live in South Africa, and in that moment, the Brits had brought a lot of Indians who were also part of the colonial empire of the UK and Great Britain into South Africa to work there, as they did in many, many other places where the Brits were colonizers. And in fighting for equal rights for Indians, Gandhi tried to put himself as close as possible next to white people. And I'm using this quote here to try and enter the next phase of the presentation, but I'll tell you why in a minute. So when we think about race and racism and everything that comes with it, I would like to ask you these two questions. Who is racist and what's racism? If there are people that want to suggest things in the comment section or even just speak something live through the mic, that's all welcome. You can go on, Terry.
Yeah, Terry.
Yeah, I think we're all racist in a way. I think anybody that doesn't say they're racist isn't unfair, because racism just isn't about colour. It can be about many things, about the things you say to people, or the background, culture, and many other things. And especially being a youth worker for such a long time now, I think one thing we can't do is accept a person for what they are. Does that make sense? For being the person who they are, you know. And I think one of the things about that is it's very difficult for a lot of people. And I'm speaking from England, so I agree with you about the Brits and colonisation and everything. But I think all of us have a tendency, you know, that sometimes we make a racist remark and we don't realise we're doing it, you know, and then you feel guilty afterwards.
Oh, great.
Thank you,
and we have quite some other comments already in the section. People saying that people who do not like Black people without any reason, or someone who discriminates on the basis of phenotype, rejecting the differences in general, and racism is a belief that Black people don't deserve same rights as white people. Racist, as for me, is someone who cannot afford, tolerate, and understand differences.
Thank you. I see Ludovic raised his hand. Please share with us.
Yeah, I'd like to say a couple of things. I think racism is mostly ignorance, because it's not really not having any kind of meaning or like a reason to discriminate people. Actually, there's always a reason, and the main one is ignorance. And the way we were brought up, or just the way we think, and mostly also I remember something really really stupid about my culture is the boogeyman, you know. It's like a children's story, and like my parents, they're not racist at all. Like they're really open-minded people. They love and respect everyone, and they brought me up to love and respect everyone. But just to show how it is imprinted in our culture, the figure of the black people as the bad one, you know, like if you don't brush your teeth or you don't eat your dinner or your veggies, the black man, the boogeyman will come and take you, you know. So it's also something very imprinted in our culture. And the second thing I'd like to say is that I'm reading a lot of comments which are partially true, but we're just talking about black people. Racism is towards any kind of phenotype and nationality. I mean, a black person saying like white people are trash is also racism. If I talk bad about Asian people, it's racism. That's all kinds of racism.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and for also addressing the other comments.
This was very useful because it kind of fits into what discourse we've been brought up to take in and learn. And the question about who's racist, usually people will have people like Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, UKIP in the UK. It's like usually the question of who's racist is always portrayed as bad people doing or saying bad things about other people that don't look like us. And what racism is usually is brought up to a level, as we've heard here, of ignorance, about not showing display or thinking that other people are less than you. But also we have this culture of the misconception of what racism is. And that's why I'm asking these questions, just to try and see what the general ideas are in the group before we dive into this. So racism, you have to differentiate it from a few words. I think you have prejudice, you have discrimination, and then you have racism. The important thing about these three words is that in general language and use, we quite a bit mix them all up together. So it is true that pretty much everyone can have a prejudice, pretty much everyone can discriminate, but to be a racist or to have the power to be a racist, I should say, is not really about ignorance, is not really about only thinking or wanting to do bad to people. It's pretty much about power, and power defined as in the ability to consciously, subconsciously impact other people's life negatively because of the way they're racialized. And I'm using racialized here as a base of what I'm trying to talk about, because it's in prejudice or in discrimination, you can discriminate people on the basis of gender, ethnicity, socioeconomical class. So that's a pretty clear tendency for why you can discriminate against people. But racism as such is something that has to do with an historical, empirical background that ties into the creation of race, which we'll talk about in a minute. So as you can see, the creation of race was solidified in Europe using the three bases. As you can see, it was religion, science or pseudoscience, and capitalism. And this is all tied into power. Power meaning who is able to decide, who is able to put forward legislation, and all of this is tied into the three elements of science, religion, and capitalism. So when I say, to just be very, like in a timeline, the enslavement of people is, for instance, something that was happening historically in a lot of places. But till a certain specific period in time, Europeans and Arabs decided to specifically enslave sub-Saharan Africans. And the enslavement of these people meant that you needed something to justify it. And justification of this happened through science, religion, which then served a certain capital interest. And when you tie those three things together with power, you get what we then called, to racialize Black people from that moment. And roughly most people use the time frame of 1492. That's when, for those who are well equipped in history, that's when Columbus basically goes on his first voyage towards the New World, as it's called. And that's when you have the creation of a Eurocentric canon of Europeans going to find a new world, as if there were no people living there. But it's also the start of the first colonies as we then came to know them. So this brought forward a period of colonization of pretty much everything that was not European all over the globe. And the next phase in that was the decolonization, and not entirely, because there are still places in the world that are part of, for instance, the UK or Great Britain, as you may, that are pretty much all over the place in South America, but also like little islands that belong to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So there's still lands and plots of lands in other spaces in the world that still belong to European powers as we speak. So when we talk about decolonization, which is a very broad topic, decolonization then ties into two elements of the physical and the mental aspects of that. So physical meaning people, countries taking back a land that was taken from them, with rules imposed by foreign powers during the period of colonization. So in many debates and in many scientific work, when it comes to, for instance, what we call Latin America, people go back to the dispute of Valladolid. I'm probably saying that wrong in Spanish, but it basically comes down to a debate which was held in the church with a very, very fundamental question asking, are non-white people devils? Do they have a soul? And this was a debate held in the highest religious faculties of Europe, where within the Catholic Church, there was this debate where basically it was then said, oh, well, they do have a soul, but they're savages, and we can only save them by colonizing them and bringing them towards the church and bringing them towards God's path, basically. It's a very big history, but that's basically the bottom line of that discussion. So by doing this religiously, morally, there was a pretty much an open gate to colonize these people or to enslave these people, because you basically had an open door saying, well, they're savages and they do need, we want to get them to become humans so that they could possibly go to heaven, if there's any place for them in heaven. So what you then get in most societies across colonized Latin America was this stratification of society. So in which, where you had the pyramid of black, the blacker you are, the more in the bottom you are in society. And if we go back to the definition of racism that ties into power, that meant the less human you are, the less power, or basically the less you were seen as part of society, as functioning part of society. You were only there to serve the needs and the interests of capitalists whom you don't see at the top of the pyramid. But as you could see the, just a local white person that was brought into South America. And then you had, if someone was mixed, let's say Spanish and indigenous, that would mean they were seen as better and more human than their own parents who are, for instance, indigenous. And if you were black, yeah, even less than. So this is a system that was then created for centuries, tying into this idea of these people need us to progress in life and as humans, because you were not seen yet as a full human being. And in the creation of race, you had a lot of scientific, pseudoscientific theory that was brought into life, both in human sciences, philosophy, geography. There was this whole conceptualization of basically saying why other races, which was then invented at that moment, why other races were better than others based on how they look. So the way you looked became a base to deserve your spot in society. The way you looked became a base why it was okay to enslave you or to colonize you, because there was a point in religion that people could use, and now they were using scientific research to basically say why you were deserving to be in the place you are in society. And an interesting element of religion is as well that people use a certain verse from the Bible in which was then referred to Black people as the brownness of their skin meaning a sin. And later on, if you look into the decolonization movements in the Caribbean, you would see that there was a lot of pushback against that. Like, my skin is not a badge of sin, but my skin is a badge of honor. You will see that in the discourse of Marcus Garvey and so on and so on. It's important to note that this is the same notion and the same plea you will then later hear in the civil rights movement, in the Black Power movement. For instance, this is a very interesting book I could not give you, but it's it's quite interesting. It's called Soul of a Nation: Art in the Age of Black Power. It's in the reaction towards this idea of the stamp of the sin of a black skin. Later on, you will see this consciousness about, but no, my skin is not a sin, which brought up I think what most people know about Black art or musically, especially in the 60s, when that became mainstream, you will hear it in the lyrics and text of many peoples across the world singing about Black pride in their music. either in the UK, US, Sub-Saharan Africa, or even the continent across. So by the creation of this myth on race, you have a second degree that made it possible to go and colonize. And by doing this, in this period, you then also had the Conference of Berlin, in which, in a period of a few years, European countries and the US came together, the US being an observer at those meetings, and Bismarck of Germany basically heading the meetings, sat together and pretty much decided how they were gonna divide the African continent amongst each other. So what you then get is the colonization of Africa, because it was a backward continent with backward people, and we could define this through religion, we could define this through science. But what you don't see and what you don't hear in firsthand was that all these rich countries, or all these now rich countries, I should say, had a lot of capital interest in these places because of natural resources or because of reasons to expand. So this ties into the following elements. So racism as a structural issue. And usually we get sucked into what I call the fruit. So what we see when you see a tree, you see the fruits. You see the tree, you see the fruits, but you don't see the roots. And by looking at racism as something structural, you are able to not only see, for instance, what we usually hear about or see on TV, or maybe even we have, some of you maybe have done it, is what you say to people, is what you see other people say to people, what you see in football stadiums, throwing bananas at black players, which also has a very racist link that ties back into the idea of black people not being human and basically being animal as close to monkeys. So all these ideas you see people manifest usually have a root. And the issue in European context is that we don't trace things back to their roots. We usually have discussions on the fruit and the tree. So by doing this, we fundamentally can't progress to solving what needs to be solved. Is this having not only a debate, but also restoration of historically disrupted powers. And for instance, one of the interesting things from my observations as a youth worker, but also as someone that travels with a lot of youngsters, is the power of passports. The power of passports is basically, since the first trip of Columbus, has been tied into this idea that Europeans have access to the entire world, but the world doesn't have access to the Western world. So this means with a European passport, and in some cases with a right European passport, meaning if you're part of the EU or if you're part of countries such as France, UK, Belgium, Italy, you basically have a free access to nearly everywhere in the world. But let's say you would have a passport from the Philippines, if you would have a passport from some sub-Saharan African country, this is basically a gate in front of your movement as person. And it's interesting from within a European Union perspective, where we were very happy with the Schengen zone and the free movement of people and capital, that you don't have this for other people. And all this is based in the idea of how dangerous other people are. And it's also tied into this very historical distrust towards non-white people. And it's when you look at the fruits, you would say, oh, someone was discriminated or they were being racist towards this person at the airport. But what you don't see is in the roots is the colonial history of basically keeping out Black people from what we call Fourth Europe, till this day, through basically paying North African countries, Turkey, a lot of money to keep out these savages. All this has a history that we can trace back to the roots. So that's why it's important to not look at racism as something that just happens, but basically as something that has a structural embedded meaning that transforms into power, and that power is then used in a certain way. When it comes, if we say in the European framework, also the access to funds. What I've noticed as a youth worker, but especially as someone that tries to work within marginalized communities, is that it's more easier for white-led organizations to access European funds, to access money, to access grants than it is for non-white organizations. Um, I don't have the numbers because I've really went to Eurostat and all these other websites trying to make some content table, but I was not able to do that based on the organizations that were getting money and receiving. But what I do know from like a local perspective, but also from the European projects I've been to, is that I always tend to see the same looking people when it comes to grants. And in Belgium, that's definitely the case on the federal and the well, local levels, is that if you say you specifically work for uh, minorities or racialized groups, what you then get is that you don't get funds. You usually get, oh yeah, you're working in a segregationist way, but usually you have white organizations that then say they're going to work in diversity and inclusion, who will get a lot of money. And then when you look at their staff and everything around them is all white. So basically, in this sense, white structure based in embedded in this racist ideals, usually that ties into the politics of assimilation, gives money to white organizations that they trust to help non-white people integrate society or assimilate into society. And it is very interesting if you look at it from like a very historical perspective, because you see the same thing happening historically during the end of enslavement, for instance, where people that had held other people in slavery basically got compensation funds in the Netherlands, in Belgium, depending on certain companies that lost money, got money back from the government. In the US, certain states got certain slave owners got money from the government because they were losing property. So it ties into this very long idea of how funds are given to a certain group and how other groups have to really fight for every penny. On Belgium, I'm going to use the Belgium context because it's the one I know best, it's the one I've studied the most, next to the Dutch and the British context. Those are the three European, well, structures of race, racism, and colonial tied history that I've studied the best. Other ones I know a bit, for instance, France I know a bit, but France and the UK had so many colonies I cannot keep up. And there's a lot of things happening in those two countries I cannot keep up with. But the Netherlands and Belgium are small enough for me to keep up with most of the things that are happening. So Belgium was created basically as a buffer between all these fighting European states. and with the first Belgian king being elected, who was partially British and German, and his wife who had French ties. So Belgium was created in 1830, and even during the creation of Belgium, the first Belgian king already had fantasies about having a colony. In a recent published book, recent like 2-3 years ago, there's this very beautiful outline stories of him trying to conquer Cuba, certain parts of Morocco. He tried everywhere, but he couldn't get a colony. So when his son Leopold II, or great grandson Leopold II, took over or became king of Belgium, he was conniving enough to get one. So what happened was that Congo was gifted to Leopold as his own private property. And what he then did there was create the Congo Free State. Interesting thing to know about Leopold and how this ties into the notion of ignorance and good and bad people, a framework that actually is completely incorrect if you look at empirical and historical material. So Leopold held a conference in Brussels, calling it the Anti-Slavery Conference. Okay, so Leopold, who's world renowned for his brutal, there are certain words I don't want to use, but unfortunately, brutal genocide regime in the Congo, held an anti-slavery conference in Brussels. The irony in this, you might say, but no, what he was basically doing was he used what even till this day is used, the framework of portraying Arabs as basically savages who are in Congo, dealing in slavery of Black people through Zanzibar to the Arab Peninsula. He used them as the black sheep of whatever he was doing, basically, whatever they were doing, sorry. And then he then used the framework of, I'm gonna help and free these people from those Arabs, and they need me to get in there. So by doing this, Leopold stayed in the framework of the pyramid I showed you earlier, in which white people are put on top, and then the Arabs in this were put in as the savages, and the Africans or the Congolese were put in as non-humans, so those who still had to be brought into their humanity, and Leopold was going to take care of this. But as history recounts, what he did there was basically collect a lot of money, and this money was used to build a lot of institutions, a lot of companies, and a lot of cities in Belgium. Even though in the first years of Congo, Leopold was losing a lot of money, but towards the end of his reign in Congo, he was able to make up a lot of money that was then used in Brussels, Antwerp, Ostend. So a lot of Belgian cities don't only owe their greatness to colonial money, it's also the direct nod towards this era. That's maybe why you will later on see in the presentation why the statues of Leopold are everywhere in Belgium, and why it's so hard for a lot of Belgian cities and as nation to recognize this fact, and why a lot of non-white and especially Black people are disgusted by seeing Leopold statues in their faces everywhere they go in certain cities. But then in 1908, basically Belgian federal state took Congo away from Leopold, saying, come on, man, what you're doing there is totally not okay. And in this case, it seems that the Belgium state would be the good guys, right? But actually what they did was they replaced what Leopold was doing, more tied into a more religious capitalistic adventure. So it became a moralization of, even though you should not kill these people, what Leopold was doing, you should try and civilize them. So it became a civilization movement instead of what Leopold was doing. But in the same time, the power stayed in the hands of Belgium. The economical growth of Congo were still used and shipped back to Belgium through companies. They brought in a lot of religious people to teach Congolese into being humans. They even created a stratification in the Congolese society tied back into this 17th, 18th century way of thinking about race and race relations, as in a pyramid and a stratification. And during this same period, what you then had was the creation of the human zoos, in which European nations will bring people from all over the world that were not white, and they will exhibit them in zoos, as we now do with non-human animals, and basically exhibit them to a white audience to show them and to justify why it was okay, because they were basically savages and we're trying to humanize them. That's why we need to keep on our stay and colonize these people.
Mohamed, I'm really sorry to interrupt, because it's so interesting and engaging. I think could go for a very long time. But if you could maybe slowly wrap it up towards one of the main focuses of today's topic, to today and to today's youth work.
We're coming there. So basically, here is like how Belgian society was basically in the Congo based on this idea of stratification. This is from a series on the Belgian TV, which basically talks about, it was actually the first series really talking about it from the perspective of Black Congolese people, tied into the perspective of white Belgians that lived in Congo in that period till 1960. And then when we're now going towards youth work, and this is why I think it's important for youth workers, because tied into the ideal of thinking that racism is an individual issue, but also thinking tied into the idea of that we live in colorblind societies, which means it's bad to see color, it's bad to identify color as a meaningful thing in society. Most of youth work, but especially frameworks of youth work, erase people. And by erasing people, I mean not seeing the needs of people from a specific starting point. So as a youth worker, or as a social worker, I might say, we're brought into the social work perspective as people who are there to safeguard cohesion, development, social change, but also using this framework of human rights. And I always stress this out to my students. We as social workers are put into this profession to try and achieve societal and social change by using the power of people that we meet. And in doing this and staying true to this definition, you cannot really stay in the confounds of colorblindedness or historical amnesia. So as youth workers, what we do is we are at the heart of change. We create spaces for interactions. We're educators, we're mediators. So this basically means as youth workers that We're constantly trying to find solutions for situations from specific people. And in order for us to do youth work that's transforming and that ties into this definition or international definition of social work, we need to recognize that power is at the heart of everything we're doing, because we already come in from a position of power as a social worker or as a youth worker. You are already being trusted with a lot of power to come into people's lives, to create spaces. And by creating spaces, you always have to be aware of your own position in this space. And that's why it's very important not to use the strategies of color blindedness. This is an example, for instance, from Belgium news, in which there was a festival called Weekend Dance, and they dressed people up as Indian and cowboys. If you know the history of Indian and cowboys, then you know it was basically a genocide. But in a lot of youth work, we use certain games that sometimes mimics these powers. And that's the same thing when it comes to I think, European laws, but that's like a whole nother field, is that you have a very broad field of youth work that's tied into this idea of assimilation. So what you get is a lot of youth workers will try and change people so that they fit in society, but they never try and change society that it fits these people. So as a youth worker, I think there are quite a few strategies you can use. And one of these strategies is, one, you can read all you want, that's one thing, but you really got to get to work. And by getting into work, this means is identifying how does your own structure look like. If you say you work for diversity or inclusion and you're trying to include people in this broader work of European society, and you look at your organization and you see there's a lack of certain demographics, then can you really do the work? Because that would imply that in some way, maybe you're still using the same strategies that have been used since, like I've already illustrated here, the elements of trying to save them instead of working with them to create a broad solution from within the starting point of these people themselves. But you cannot do that with organizations that are totally not diverse themselves. A second strategy is, as youth workers, we need to find ways in how we protect people in certain spaces. For instance, what I've noticed in a lot of meetings, and this goes in the terms of gender and race, most of the time when I'm in meetings, me as a black guy that's seemingly very young, when I'm in spaces, people tend not to look at my knowledge or my expertise. They tend to look at my white colleagues for answers, while my white colleagues would be like, yeah, but actually that's not my field, you should be talking to him. So there's always this silver lining, there's always this framework in which you can tell that there's this power sequence that's tied to gender, that's tied into race. And as a youth worker, you should be aware of this when you're working with non-men co-workers, but also when you're working with non-white co-workers, meaning when you enter a space with them, identify that you're in a position of privilege, as I may say, that enables people to maybe listen much faster to your ideas. But then it becomes, how do you break that framework? Usually you break that framework by explicitly calling out people on their behaviors at the moment, but it can also be by completely being silenced in that meeting and putting someone else at the forefront in their own power and in their own strength. Another strategy is when working with youngsters specifically, you try and work in a triangle of using power, so letting youngsters recognize how power works in society at a very, let me say, at the age that they understand what power is. Usually youngsters already feel what it is, power, because they know who's calling the shots. And if you have kids or you work with kids, you always know that they will try and find, even in a household, they'll look for the parents that they know has the most decision-making power, and they try to be as close to those people. So youngsters and kids are not stupid. They really know who's calling the shots. Use the same strategies with your youngsters to identify power and decision-making in structures and organizations, and then include them from this position of them having something to decide, not something to say, something to decide, because there's an inherently different thing in having something to say than having something to decide. Because having something to say, everyone can say something. You can have a round table and ask for people's opinions, and then you decide something else. But putting power where it belongs means basically the amount of agency you can give to others, and even how you can withdraw yourselves from this. And in my own practice, I think 99% of all the projects I've created so far, I've found the balance between, in the first maybe year, because of experience doing a lot, but in the second year, step by step withdrawing and giving it to the people that it was created with and created for. My functionality should be limited to using my access and my power in society so that they have access to power, funds, and other means. Those are a few strategies. I cannot see the chat, so I don't know. These are just reports that I've collected from Belgian society, for instance, in which you will clearly see how power is tied to decision making. So for instance, in Belgium, but also in other European countries, but I have the Belgian numbers here. Black people are the highest educated people in Belgium. But if you look at employment rate, and especially being employed in jobs that fit their level of credentials and degree, it's very low. So you're looking at 50% of people working below their diploma. So this means as youth workers, we need to advocate for people's degrees to be recognized within Europe, or find solutions for them being able to do courses that can tie those potentials into a framework that fits the context of your nation. So if it's Holland, Belgium, or whatever. But also what you see in a lot of European reports and in this Belgian report is that a lot of Black people or people who have been colonized in the past find it that in the societies where they live, talking about race and colonial past is a taboo topic. And then as youth work, you can talk about these things, but what you cannot forget is, as you can see here, racism has a material impact on people. If you have a master's degree and you're working below that, you're earning less. That means you can feed your kids less. That means you can't live in a potential space where you want to live. So racism doesn't only impact people's mental health, but it also impacts their physical and impacts their financial health. So as a youth worker, this is something you should be aware of, because there's a lot of statistics about non-white people, for instance, being poorer in society. You should look at this from, okay, but why are they poor? Is it because they don't work harder? No, that's usually not the case. Is it because they're not highly educated? Usually also, as you can see here, that's clearly not the case. So then unfortunately, you have to conclude there's like a structural problem, and then you should start from that perspective, because if you start from that perspective, you will learn to look at people from within their strengths and not seeing them as victims. They are victims of a structural societal problem, but they're not losers, so to speak. Because usually people like you really have this really belittling imagery of, oh, that's so bad, but that's so bad as a youth worker is not enough. Because in the heart of youth work, or in the heart of social work, we're human rights defenders. So it's very important to start from this perspective of human rights defending, and not only the perspective of, oh, poor guy, you cannot find a job that you deserve. That's cool if you say that to a friend, but as a social worker, your job requires more from you.
Well, this is really like a prophecy, you know, at the end of it, because I think no matter how much we know, every time we are consciously and subconsciously, but sometimes even not differentiating it, whether it comes from our heritage or our education or just as a part of a very bad habit, we keep doing it to our young people. And this sentence that you said, I think I personally already am taking my most favorite of it. Letting people talk is not enough. Letting people decide is what we should aim for. And I'm really sorry that I am in a way jumping into the presentation, but I have a few good news on this as well. The presentation will be available for everybody who registers for today ID Talk. So that's one thing. Second, I'm jumping in because we want still to give you also some space to talk about it. So in a moment, Maria, my colleague, she will be sending you to Zoom rooms and we will ask you to come back with a short question or short comment still to address and to ask Mohamed about anything that you heard today, something that was inspiring, interesting, provoking, maybe controversial to you. So we will send you to these Zoom rooms just for 10 minutes. And when you come back, we will have more opportunity to listen to Mohamed, but also to hear your questions and try to address it. What we have decided to do, since our time is quite scarce today, we would like to hear from all the groups, your questions, your comments, and then ask Mohamed maybe to make some notes for yourself so you can address all of them at once in the end. And additionally, we would ask also, if possible, that every group puts their question or comment in writing in the chat, because that's how we can also take note of them for the article in the future. Some people are returning to our ID Talk, so they know what's the routine. And just before going to break, we had one more question that I would like to read out loud for you, Mohamed. Maybe you can also address it. It's about this case, not very uncommon, unfortunately, about people applying for jobs with white and non-white, or Swedish and non-Swedish in this case, names, and being treated differently at the job markets. Maybe if you could also address that in line with the other questions. So please, group number one, what is your comment, your question, or your one take that you have?
Hello, I'm Alexia. I'm speaking on behalf of the first group. I'm one of the people that keeps returning to the ID Talks. You remember me? Okay. And we had a lot of shy people in the group, so I had to take over, let's say. 3 of us were from the Balkan area, one from Egypt and one didn't speak, probably was busy. So what the Balkans said is that we couldn't form a specific question. I don't think we had enough time. We had too many things to consider. But basically for Mohamed is that we do realize our privileged positions are as Europeans. And we do realize the power of the passports outside the EU. But still, we also, although we cannot be in your shoes as a Black person coming from a colonized country, etc., we do experience racism within Europe against Balkans for stereotypes, as we already mentioned. And I'm sure you would have mentioned more extensively if you had 3 hours available. We kind of get it, not exactly, obviously. And we basically wondered, how that would be overcome, how, because I was shocked by the fact that more funds are going to white groups, white organizations, as you mentioned, than other colors. For me, it was, I was wondering if it has to do with the practicalities, which one has to be the board of, which people have to be the board of directors and which people have to actually do the work, depending on the legal system that is in every country. I don't really know these details. So this is why it seems like the white people are getting the money, but maybe the black people are operating them. I have no idea. So that would be my question. The girl we had from Egypt was basically wondering about something that is explained through the Erasmus Plus program. Why are all opportunities for volunteers, etc., like the highest percentage of them, not all of them, are for Europeans and not also the other countries? There is an explanation for that, but I had to mention it. So basically, this is more or less what we said. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Group number 2, you put your question in the chat, but if somebody could very briefly, in like really 15, 20 seconds, just formulate it as a question and present to Mohamed. Group number 2, somebody, a spokesperson from group number 2, please. Okay, then we can go to group number 3. In the meantime, I will try to read the comment as well later for you. Group number 3, do you have a question or a comment for our attention?
Yeah, hi, it's Terry from the UK. One of the things, I'll keep it very short. We said that, George and myself said, we have hope in our young people, this kind of generation of present, and that they will have a real voice. And what I mean by a real voice, that adults will listen for a change, politicians and many other people in positions. And I think that might not be the answer about what race is about, but it's about young people. Black Lives Matter, Mohamed, the group I work with, was so much behind it and so much behind these things that young people, given the opportunity to have a voice, it works. And I think the other thing is to stop the racism against young people like Greta Thunberg and people like that, and young black people. Marcus Rashford speaks out a lot in the UK. I know you don't believe how quiet I am, but that's it, Anna.
Thank you very much, and very happy to see you back, Terry. I think you are also one of our returning participants. We are very happy to see your faces back here. Yeah, thank you very much for the comment.
Sure, smile on it.
Thank you. You're making me blush. And also we have another comment from group number 2. It's mostly a comment, not questions, really appreciating the talk and pointing out the main takes that the group has from the presentation, Mohamed. So thank you very much for that. And now we're ready to hear group number 4. Please unmute yourself. Yes,
I don't know if Sharon or Yuika can, because we didn't decide anything. So
since you're unmuted, just go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, you can take it. It's fine.
Thank you. So the first part was Sharon talking about the issue about the curriculum, also linked with the topic of why in Sweden, but don't worry, it's also in the other countries. People tend to take off the pictures, not to show the real identity so much, hoping that they can be chosen just because of their skills and the competencies that they show, and not because of the aspect. But there is also the topic of the name, because sometimes the name doesn't sound like autochthon, like local. So how to cover this, no? So it's a problem, and how can we overcome somehow, if we can overcome? One of the considerations I said, I think it depends a lot on who is the receiver, because if the receiver is an organization, an NGO who really like diversity and need diversity in the team, maybe this is an extra value, an added value. But if you are in a multinational, in a very squared thinking environment, maybe this is very complicated to overcome. And
thank you, Luisa.
There was just another consideration, but it's a little bit complicated. Just in a few words, is about not just the exclusion, but from people which are a little racist or with prejudice, but also the auto-exclusion of people that have already had bad situations, so that they don't apply anymore. They prefer to auto-exclude. How can we overcome this? Finish.
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, very important questions. And the super task for Mohamed is to try to address them in a very short time. In the meantime, we have one more group, group number 5, to come back with their question or comment. Please, you have the floor now. Somebody just unmute yourselves and go on. Group number 5.
I
Please,
was in group number 5. And we didn't really come up with a specific question. We just had some really interesting conversation. I think what we can take out of the conversation would be maybe, if I put it into a question, that would be maybe to address how there is definitely discrimination, but there's also racism. Just to kind of, because just to give a bit of a background for myself, I do talks on racism and prejudice in Iceland, and I am personally aware of the different kind of aspects of what racism and prejudice is, and that it's kind of all part of a big system, but it's separate entities, like Mohamed, I think, described very clearly. But that's just because I've really looked into the matter, and I think maybe to kind of put up the different aspects of it would be really helpful. I think that would be good for, yeah, if you're thinking about for the article, or to, you know, address that issue.
Miria, and if I may, I think you were the one who actually guessed that quote came from Gandhi, no?
Yeah. It took me a while to connect the dots, but I remember reading it before, so yeah.
Thank you very much for the questions, the comments, and just maybe to remind that apart from today's answers to your questions, these are also informing a bit and helping Mohamed to shape the article that is coming up and will be part of the idtalks magazine. So Mohamed, you have now the floor. Please, we are waiting to hear from you.
All right. So I think on the matter of the job market, basically there are a few strategies that have been used across European nations. One of them being blind, sending in like blind CVs. Unfortunately, what you see there is like if people get through the first round and then they enter the second round where you actually have to meet people, that even there's a barrier, meaning, oh yeah, actually you do look not from here. So that becomes a stop point for you in this process. And then the other aspect of it in Belgium, there's been a 10-year-old debate going on, which is on, we call it praktijktesten in Belgium. It basically means the government sending in CVs, anonymously differentiating names, and just trying to see what organization would do. Would they hire someone and basically not hire someone else based on the differentiation of that? And if that's the case, should those organizations or companies be punished? Because racism is illegal, it's a legal offense. So then there should be this legal framework into punishing companies that discriminate or are racist towards a certain people. So that's like a strategy that's been put forward a lot, but unfortunately, it's really hard to find governments and government officials who are really behind this solution. The most important thing there is just to remind those government officials and local people that racism is actually punishable by law. So it's not just some thing that people do, but it's actually something you should be penalized for by European or national laws. Um, I think that on the topic of it's in the same topic where you had the suggestions that NGOs would be maybe better than multinationals. Unfortunately, not a part of the last slide of the presentation. I was going to show that a study in Belgium actually found that even within NGOs, the structure of NGOs really uh, shows the power dynamic in society. So when you enter the basic level of volunteers, you see a lot of diversity. When you enter management, you see some diversity, but when you enter towards the top of NGOs, it's all white, and usually more male and female here and there. So it's even in the NGO world, there's this mirroring of the pyramids I was showing you before. There's even that mirroring is also in there. That's why I think it's very advisable for a lot of you to check the structures of your own organizations, but also when you're working with partners that are like championing themselves on the topics of diversion, inclusion, anti-racism, to really ask them who's on the top of your organization, who's on the bottom of the organization, and how does this fit into the framework we're trying to operate within. I think this helps you to just know who you're dealing with and how people like talk the talk but don't walk the walk. So I think that maybe clarifies. And basically, a lot of multinationals actually, because of the economical resources they can get from diversity, really try to hire a lot of diversified people because they know by having multiple perspectives in a company allows you to reach a broader audience, allows you to communicate in different styles. So for a lot of multinationals, it's just a financial strategy. So it's not a moral issue as a lot of NGOs would put forward, but it's sometimes just how to make more money is by having a diverse group that can branch into diverse markets from multinationals. And then the element of young people and what they can bring to the table. I think what history, and this is very recent history of the last 15 years in Europe has shown us, is that there's unfortunately, whenever there's a rise of young people voicing matters that really go into the core of their beliefs, you usually have 2-3 years before that dies out. And by that, I mean lawmakers and policymakers would listen. Just I was referring earlier in the talk, they will listen, but that does not mean that there's decisions being taken. So even with what you saw during the BLM protest and prior to that, is that young people were forced into positions of in something in some and sometimes just doing revolutionary acts and using violence if needed, because of all these years of suppressed feelings they've had walking through racist societies where they're racialized and deemed less than. They have been forced to like go to violence, and what you then get is usually the condemnation of violence, but not really the solution to the problems that cause this violence. So even though I'm very hopeful, like as a person, I'm very hopeful, but I cannot be blind to these historical tendencies of how, in a lot of ways, racism works within the European institution. It's actually very interesting if you look at the numbers of representatives that are not white in the European Parliament, and you compare that to the statistics of non-white people living in those countries. It's shocking, honestly. Even at that level, it's shocking, and I think what young people have been able to do during the BLM protests is create a platform, and that's what young people usually do, because they voice what really matters to them. They create a platform and they give a space to those in power that look like them to not only voice their pain, but also push for structural changes. I've seen a few movements in European law, like in February of this year, where I think 8 countries in Europe were basically condemned and asked to put in their legal framework that racism is legally illegal, so to speak, and that they should have a legal framework to tackle racism in their own countries. That's a direct win because of those young people that were criminalized and brutalized this summer. So that, I think that's very important when we're talking about the impact of youth and youth work, is showing that even though we are not in power, but youngsters do push the envelope and do help policymakers to be a bit more bold and play less safe. What you usually have with elections, people play safe because they're trying to maintain power. So youngsters in the previous summer actually helped those policymakers to actually step up to the plate. I think when it comes to access and rules, and why some organizations have more access to money and others don't, has to do with the way, I don't know if any one of you have ever had to fill in European grant papers. It's a thesis, basically. You're writing a master's thesis. It's 50 pages when you're done. It's using language that's so bureaucratic. It's so serious. It's so, yeah, you get tired by doing it. Now imagine being in a position of dealing with a lot of other things in your life, and then having to apply to the same institution that's using Frontex and all these things to keep people that look like you out of its borders, to then apply for money, telling them why you need the money, but also having to find the words that fit their framework so that they can still give you the money. It's just tiring, honestly. I've done it like once or twice, and I could have only completed it because I had 2-3 other people helping me with the writing. So when it comes to, I think the structure of how grants can be applied for are inherently focused on higher educated people that have access to language that is understood within higher ranks of power and bureaucrats. And this means that if you don't speak bureaucratic language, you don't get the funds. Because I know a lot of organizations that do amazing work on the ground, but could never get a grant because they don't use the language that people want to read. So that's the issue. And when it comes to, so that's the issue why white organizations get the money, because usually it's the same thing in education, in the job market. The people that already, due to this structured racism, already have 2 steps ahead can always stay 2-3 steps ahead, because you're always catching up to what they know of the structure, but also the rules are constantly changing. So what you then have, for instance, is if you have you have, I call them companies, honestly. You have NGOs that work as companies that get grant after grant after grant because they've found this way of speaking the European language and just putting in grants to collect money in the name of immigrants, in the name of non-white people, in the name of the Roma community, in the name of marginalized communities all across Europe, because they speak this language, and it's a money-making model for them. So now if you have those people and then you have someone who's just a youth worker that's trying to make change on a local level, but then it's like, oh, I want to do things on a European level, then you get a form of the European grant and you look at it and you're like, damn, how am I even going to start on this? So it just doesn't give you the energy you need. And I think that's where the power, as I was saying, recognizing power and your access comes in, and that's to organizations such as Salto and other ones. That's where you come in, because what you basically can do is not only advocate for the change of rules for organizations that are non-white led, black led, to have easier access to funds so that they can gain, because with money you buy time, you buy expertise, and you cannot just grow expertise. You need the time to literally buy expertise sometime. So I think we need to find ways for national agencies to advocate for these organizations, to maybe have a way of getting grants in the first 2-3 years, to have a formal setup of their organizations so that they can then do whatever other organizations do, because they're not in the place money-wise, time-wise, energy-wise, to do the things as they should be done. So that's where Salto and the other organizations come in, because that's the only way you're going to be able to broaden the field and literally have a true diversity and inclusive way of working, because you're operating in the system, but you need to open the gates a bit more. So that other organizations can come in that already do great work. So I think it's about structure, it's about rules, and it's about access to those things.
Thank you so much, Mohamed. I think if we had another 3 hours, indeed, like somebody said from our participants, we could continue talking about it. But unfortunately, our time is limited.
Yeah.
What is not limited is the amount of resources that we will send to you later on, based on the talk, the article, and all the previous talks and articles that are already recorded and part of the idtalks magazine and on our YouTube channel. So please stay tuned and continue joining back to the idtalks every second week on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Central European time. But now, before we go, there is always this moment when people might have forgotten about. Olaja, our amazing graphic recorder, is going to do her reveal of the recording she has done today. So Olaja, you have now the floor, and we are very impatient to see what came out of it.
Thank you so much. I wonder if you can see my screen already.
Yep.
All right. So yeah, this has been a very inspiring talk. Thank you very much, Mohamed, for this.
Welcome.
I don't have many things to say, to be honest. I think it has been, from my graphic recording experience, a very straightforward approach to racism and yeah, its origin, its consequences up to the current days, and also very interesting part of sharing these strategies and, again, approaches that we as social workers or youth workers should and, well, can and should take into account when we work in our daily activities with youth. So yeah, I think for now, this is just a visual extract. It will be a bit developed and then shared with everyone who signed up for the talk.
Thank you very, very much, Olaja. Also, parts of this graphics we are using in the magazine to accompany the article that all our speakers deliver after the talk. For today, yeah, this is it. Some maybe closing remarks from your side, Mohamed, maybe something you are taking from today's ID talk. Please, you have the floor.
I think I would actually want to hear from other people, but for me, I'm taking away that actually unfortunately, a lot of these systems operate the same way in different countries. That's like it's something you basically theoretically know, but every time you have these conversations, it's just kind of like, oh yeah, it just confirms, unfortunately, this structural thing you see.
Mohamed, I'd just like to say one thing to you. I had some young people signed off an application. Wasn't a large amount of money. The organisation rang me and said, we're not accepting this because young people have signed it. And I had to support the application. So I'd better be careful the language I use because I know I'm on Europe. But I more or less told them where to stick that application. Excuse my English words. But I told them, I said, you're letting young people down. You're not accepting their voice. And I think it's true what you're saying about Europe. I mean, I've done a lot of exchanges. And to be honest with you, you feel as though you're writing your life away, particularly when you're trying to involve young people in the project and some of the words. And I think the problem is people overuse the English language with the formal English instead of the more informal English. I know that sounds rather, maybe, but when you're talking to a lot of young people, they don't even know what you mean by formal because, it's very difficult. And I know there's people here of other languages as well, but I would say they have the same. One thing maybe to say to Anna is that the one good thing I like about this is how people can express themselves and not feel insecure about expressing themselves. You guys are really creating a revolution here. And I think this guy today has even created a bigger revolution because it's been absolutely fantastic. And I am saying that, Mohamed, you've been very honest. And it's good coming because youth workers sometimes are not open enough, to tell people, well, stick it, and I think that's the one good thing today, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody. Before you leave, we would like to just ask you kindly to leave a one-word feedback to today's session. We're collecting it into a word cloud. What is your main take? What is your emotions at the moment? And after you're done, feel free to go back to your work and to work more for youth empowerment, to work towards a better future and better Europe and a better world for all of us. Thank you very much, everybody. And we hope to see you back in 2 weeks. Ciao, ciao.